Well, welcome everyone. Today's presentation is part of the Culture Builds Communities webinar series. This community-based project is designed to help Native communities plan and develop cultural facilities. Culture Builds Communities is a project of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. Major funding is provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Museum of the American Indian. Thank you so much for being here today.
Okay. Yeah, and thank you again for your attendance. We're excited to be here, and we hope that the information that we deliver today is going to be of some use. We are talking about exhibit planning for Indigenous community museums and interpretive centers. And I know that the outline for the presentation had mentioned that it was Split Rock Studios, but I have a couple of other presenters with me, whom I will introduce now. If they're not on mute, of course.
Oh, I don't think I'm on mute. Can everybody hear me?
I can now, Lydia.
Okay. Hi.
The prompt may have been missed, and that's okay, but we can hear Lydia, and hopefully Eric is there too, who are also presenting.
Okay. Hello, my name is Lydia Forthorns. I am the Cultural Center General Manager for the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. I have been working with Split Rock Studios for the past 3 years on our inaugural exhibit. We've completely finished our project about a little over a year ago. So we've had our first year anniversary right in the middle of this pandemic. So you can imagine what kind of challenges that we're having with some of the operations, and what we had expected for our first year isn't quite exactly what we thought or had planned. I have been working for Indian country in a variety of aspects in planning and economic development and cultural programming for here in the Midwest for tribes in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Also had a little bit of experience living on the East Coast, working for the Smithsonian. I have my Associates of Fine Arts and Museum Studies in Three-Dimensional Design from the Institute of American Indian Arts, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Pratt Institute in New York. Thanks for inviting me, Colin.
And good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Zimmer. I'm a historian from Western South Dakota. I live in Rapid City, right here in the heart of Lakota country, where I was born and raised. And I've spent the last 10 years or so working in a variety of capacities with Native communities. I did my doctoral work working with the Meskwaki Nation in Iowa, if anybody's familiar with those folks. And have also been involved in a number of museum development as well as community activism projects all across the country for Native communities. And it's I've worked with Split Rock a couple different times on major exhibit development projects. And I just want to let everybody know how excited we are to be here, and to let you know that we welcome questions or comments at length at the end of our talk here, because we really want this to be as useful for everybody as possible.
Thank you, Eric. And I am Colin Cook, and I was the project manager on the SMSC project. So I was Lydia's direct contact. My company is Split Rock Studios, and we are a design build firm that specializes in exhibits for museums, cultural centers, visitor centers. Prior to that project, a number of years ago, I worked at Good Earth Blood Run State Park, and that was actually run through the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks Department, but they had representatives from the Omaha, Iowa, Oto, and Ponca tribes there. So it's a different working environment, and I think that having been on two very different projects, that helps me gain some insight into how tough it can be to pull together exhibits, just in general too. And why we're here today, why we think we can help, is because of that recent experience. When Lydia and I first met, almost 3 years ago, We were at the very beginning of the exhibit project, but yet the building had advanced, I think, past design. So it was in the detailed design phase. So we were a little behind the 8 ball there. But having gone through that whole process from the very early stages of design to the actual installation, we think that some of that experience can be, I guess, conveyed to you so that you can learn from some things that maybe we might have done differently. I can honestly say that with that particular project, the SMSC one, I've been a project manager for 15 years at Split Rock Studios. The sensitivities mentioned in this third bullet point also, I think, gave me an opportunity to grow as a person. I learned a lot, and I think it ultimately gave me a more personal stake in the exhibit that was produced. And so we're here to say that we have done this, we've been there, and we're here to help. Eric or Lydia, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think from, adding to Colin's piece about being this very personal, I mentioned a little bit that, I had some museum studies background and working for other various tribes in programming as well. But, I'd had some experience working versus internships and contract work with the Smithsonian at the National Museum of American Indian. And I thought that when, taking the work that I do, working for tribal people was so much more important, because this is an exhibit that is coming from the voice of the people. It's coming from members, and it makes it so much more critical that these stories are told from a tribal perspective, and not something that, was kind of sort of seen through a federal scope and have to go through that review or any sort of state offices as well. So making this project more unique to me, and teaching the community about what we do in the museum industry to people, and helping them understand that, there are ways that, we can make those internal changes to make sure that our voices are heard. So that was another piece that made this very personal for me as well, being Sicangu Lakota.
And I just wanted to add, to sort of echo both what Colin and Lydia shared, but also what's on the screen here. I think that there's probably going to be things that we talk about this morning that overlap a little bit with some of the other webinars and sessions that you've all had. But the big point that we want to make is just the scope and scale of how complicated these projects are to pull off. Exhibits are enormous, extremely challenging, and extremely detailed undertakings. And although we are going to share some experiences that we've had to help get you thinking about things that you could be looking out for, and we'll sort of frame it in the context of challenges that we faced and overcame, I think we want to remind everybody that even though it's hard work, it is worth every second of it. It is enriching, powerful, an enormous contribution to communities who develop in cultural institutions and museums to tell their stories. And everything I just said and what Colin and Lydia just shared is true for every exhibit project we work on, but it is especially true given the enormous challenges that have dotted the histories that Indigenous peoples face. As we'll talk in a couple moments here, and as many of you know far better than I do personally, because of the violence, the disease, the dispossession, all of the aspects of colonization that Native communities have had to work through, the process of developing an exhibit will ultimately lead to some tough conversations about parts of the story that have eroded or been lost over time, and how to reclaim them and frame them back to the community. And so there's extra detail and effort that goes into that. And I just want to take a quick second here to plug my friends at Split Rock, Colin and those guys. The times that I've worked with Split Rock, unlike any other design build firm or contracting team that I've worked with, really believes in empowering Native communities to tell these stories and puts the time and effort into doing it. And it's always an honor and a pleasure to work with them on these projects. And with that, I think Colin wants to talk a little bit about their process.
Yeah, and as Eric mentioned, it's actually a very large undertaking. But what we've done here through the magic of graphic design is simplify all of that in an easy to an easy to look at chart here. It's likely that in previous presentations you have seen something very similar to this for how a building gets developed. And our process is somewhat unique in that it's a design build process. So there's different ways of doing it. There is a design bid build. You are not looking at that here, but they all have one thing in common, and that is they have all these different checkpoints. You know, in this instance, we're looking at the kickoff, schematic design, design development, pre-production. Throughout all those phases, there's a number of different submittals that get delivered, and typically the hope is that our client is going to review those deliverables, and then normally like we set down a time frame, like, hey, we need you to review the schematic design 1 document and send it back to us in 2 weeks. And I think what I learned through not only the SMSC project, but also the Good Earth project, is that this process very much needs to be adaptive. And I guess what I would hope is that you consider ahead of time how you're going to provide that review of the different documents, so that everything that's coming at you and all the people that it has to be shared with, you don't want people caught off guard or stressed out about having to do this, because yes, it's an awful lot of work. I will say that I think the most important step, it starts in the kickoff, but I think it goes all the way through design, is achieving of a level of comfort with your contractor and gaining trust. I think that those are the keys to a successful project. And however, what you're going to want to say to that firm is, however you think you're going to need to achieve this, we think this is what it's going to take. You're going to have to adapt the process so that people get a chance to spend time together.
Yeah, the kickoff meeting for us was really a time where we could sort of really kind of get to know each other, get to know the various personalities that were going to be on board, and understanding what roles we were going to play, and that one is important. It's critical.
And then I guess Eric and Lydia were telling me about this before, how every time I look at this process sheet, I've seen it numerous times, and it all makes perfect sense to me. But I can understand if people have questions regarding it. And as Eric mentioned, we're going to have time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. But again, I have to strike home that when you're looking at schematic design, which is the second, the bullet point to the bottom left, that normally is like 2 submittals, okay? And it has some renderings in it. I'm going to go back really quick. Like you're looking at the top left or top right slide here, this photo, that's a rendering from the schematic design. And so you're kind of trying to learn what sort of exhibit ideas and methodologies are going to be useful, what you like, what you don't like. And the only way that we're going to find out what people do like and don't like, right, is if we hear that feedback. And so I guess what I'm getting at is how important that feedback is. The bottom right photo is actually the completed exhibit that you're seeing there. Okay, and I'll turn it over. Oh, and just to ease your mind maybe a little bit too, this process can be stretched out over 1 to 3, maybe 4 years. So it all doesn't just happen in a year or anything. It depends on the size of the exhibit, but there still is time. And when you're working with your exhibit's contractor on that schedule and how you're going to get that feedback, hopefully it can be as stress-free as possible. I'm going to turn the next slide over to Lydia and Eric, unless Eric or Lydia, do you have anything else to add to this slide?
No, if you go ahead and switch it. I did notice that Susan asked a question about who should be at that kickoff meeting, and that's a great question, Susan, and I'll sort of address it as I talk here. as Colin mentioned, you know, trust is fundamental to this process. And if you're working with any, you know, build firm or design firm, their process might look a little different around the edges, or they might use different words than what Colin had on that last screen, but it'll be fundamentally the same thing. You know, you go from conceptualization to design to actually creating content, selecting images, to approving all of that, and then finally building the thing. And, you know, usually the team consists of a project manager like Colin, whose job is to keep everything sort of on track and coordinate everybody, a developer, which would be my role, which is the person who helps, you know, develop theme ideas, storyboards, write exhibit content, select photos, help select artifacts, do that sort of stuff, and a designer, who are the, you know, really creative, talented people who draw the space and draw the renderings and the pictures to help the fabrication team bring it to life. And then you usually have a representative, in this case, or in Colin and Lydia's case, you know, Lydia, who would be from the client side or the, you know, cultural centers side, whose job is to keep everything, you know, on track from their end. And before I get to the question about the kickoff, on this theme of trust, as Colin mentioned, for a project like these ones, you're going to be living with these folks for at minimum a year, probably 2, and in some cases 3 and even 4 years. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you'll learn along the way is that it's fundamental to have sort of open dialogue and to build that rapport, largely because, unfortunately, the moment we're at, you know, in history and in the field, despite the great work that organizations like ATALM and staff members like the people, you know, listening to this are, chances are you're going to end up working with a predominantly non-native design team, right? And even people who have been working for years and years in this field are going to make mistakes. They might say the wrong thing in a meeting. They might not be aware of culture and cultural and community protocols. They certainly, you know, as everybody knows, I think there's what, 572 or 574 federally recognized tribes in the US. So there's this enormous diversity. And even if you've been doing this for a long time, if you land on a new project somewhere, it's going to take time to get up to speed with how that community understands its story, what the, you know, sort of rules are for interacting with outsiders, and all of that just takes time, and it's something to be aware of. One of the ways that you can do this, and this gets to Susan's question, is from the very beginning, in fact, before the kickoff meeting, even right now, if you're thinking about doing one of these projects, is to think about who you want to be in that session, right? So at the kickoff meeting, there should be the 4 or 5 people I just mentioned from the project team, but oftentimes it makes really good sense to develop a steering committee of community members who will be there at that kickoff meeting to be able to ask questions and shape the vision for the project from the very beginning. And I recently worked on a project with Split Rock for you know, a Native nation that includes 3 different tribes with separate histories, all on one reservation that's very large and disparate and rural. And it was important to them that we had on that steering committee representation from each of the 3 tribes, a man and a woman from each of the 3 tribes, a balance between elders and, you know, younger up-and-comers in the community, and also sort of a cross-section of different professionals from the community. So artists, museum people, historians, folks from the TIPO's office, folks from other parts of the community. And so it took a lot of pre-planning and work, number one, to build the list of who we thought needed to be there, to invite them and get them to participate. But then in the case of community outreach projects, to literally do the work of having a logistical plan for how we were going to get these people across a very, you know, large reservation community, when most of them are volunteers and had day jobs and families and all of that stuff, right? So it's fundamental to have all of that in place, but it takes a lot of advanced work and thinking to make sure you get that balance right and communicate it to your design team so that they know what the reasoning is, who these folks are, and everybody can begin building that trust from the front end. And I know Lydia wanted to talk, I think, a little bit about the steering committee experience that they had at Shakopee.
Yeah, I think that, you know, every tribe is different. You know, everyone comes from different areas, and every tribe is different. Just even in terms of mentioning, you know, compensating some of the members. Some feel that is really critical, important in places that I've worked otherwise. Others didn't feel that it was an issue, but a lot of times it's keeping that momentum going and keeping, sometimes there were at times where I felt like I was a cheerleader constantly, you know, come on, we're almost there. We're almost there. We're coming close. And, you know, as he mentioned, it was a 3-year project, but by the time we had entered into working on the exhibit, it had seemed as though, you know, we had lost time, like the construction of the space and also of the facility, it could have been probably done a little earlier and done maybe in tandem. At sometimes it did feel from some of the people that it was daunting, especially towards the end. Because not only for us as a new facility, it was not only the exhibit, but it were also basic business operations and, you know, staffing and programming and, you know, everything, you know, kind of all happening in tandem at the same time. And, you know, making sure that that communication is happening within the tribe, you know, keeping the council involved and for them to understand what direction, and, you know, maybe we might need to get excuse me, you know, legal involved for, you know, certain areas in the exhibit, and making sure our marketing department has gone through some of these reviews so that the messaging is consistent, and keeping, you know, keeping the elders involved and making sure that you know, is stated in the correct form. It does, you know, it does take, you know, maybe sections of people instead of, you know, saying this is just, you know, kind of the one steering group. There are also various components, because we did talk a little bit, and I know we were going to talk about it later, but getting objects for the exhibit as well is a whole nother story too.
I did want to just touch on, you know, these 2 other points we had up on the screen here before we move on. And that is, in addition to the, you know, planning and advisory group that we were talking about a minute ago, to be thinking from the front end also about who you might want to put in charge of helping review, and in some cases, maybe even if you have the resources, help develop the content that will go. I mean, if you look at that picture on the bottom right there, everything that you see in that image was a decision that was made and had to be created, right? I mean, I'm talking about from the words and the pictures that appear in that flip book and the graphic panel in the background, to every detail that went into the shape of that structure, the wood framing, the items that are hung up on the inside, and then on the right, that mural. Everything that's depicted on that mural has to reflect the community's sort of consensus about an accurate representation about what its, you know, history and the parts of that story were, right? Mm-hmm. And it's an enormous amount of work. And oftentimes one of the challenges that I've seen the most is that you have a steering committee of volunteer people who are very involved and dedicated, and they donate their time to come to the meeting. And but you know, oftentimes you end up in a situation where an outsider like me, like a developer who's not part of the community, will write, you know, the first draft of the text or you know, the first submittal for content, and it won't resonate with the community, but then the community won't have someone on hand who has the time and resources to get in the trenches and help rewrite and develop that stuff, right? And it gets especially sensitive around areas where there may be a community sense of a story that needs to be told, but for one reason or the other, through the long history of the, as I mentioned before, the, you know, oftentimes terrible things that have happened in Native communities, the stories, the sources, the material to support the content development can be missing. You know, it can be lost in some cases. And so being able to navigate that and work with people in the community who have the relationships and have the knowledge and experience to be able to go out to the community and get that information so that it can be integrated is just an enormous undertaking in and of itself. And it's just something that's really important, again, to be thinking about from the front end.
Yeah, and I had one point on that. There were certain items when Eric was explaining the lodge here, made me think about you know, in our experiences, and, you know, really being able to tap your own tribal resources, working with the other various department, like your natural resources, your land department, your graphics, your communications department, keeping them involved, keeping the council informed, for like case in point, you know, we had our cultural resources director had very specific guidelines on how how our birch bark lodge was going to be built and what materials were supposed to be used. We utilized our land department to identify certain pieces of wood that were going to be used on property within our reservation that were going to be used for that lodge. So just, you know, kind of tapping into some of that, whether there are certain illustrative kind of items or, you know, photography that could be done locally. You know, those are some of the questions that, you know, should be addressed if that's something that the tribe or the group really feels strongly about.
Okay. The top, so the bottom right photo is, yeah, from Good Earth State Park. The top right is an example of how we adapted process. We went down to SMSC, and myself and our writer, so in this case that would be like the Eric Zimmer of the project, went down to SMSC. We gathered with, they did have a steering committee selected, and everybody got together in this theater, and we went one by one through every graphic, every word of text, every photo that was on there. And that was by far the best way to get feedback from everybody. They could speak up in the meeting, we could make changes to the text on the fly. And, you know, again, I will mention that that may not be a typical process, but if you think that's going to be the easiest way for you to solicit or to get that feedback and deliver it to whoever you hire, then you just got to let them know ahead of time so they can plan around it. You want them to adapt to what's going to work for you in the community. Eric, did you already touch on Eric and Lydia, did you touch on the bottom bullet?
I think I tried to in my last response there, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So I think this slide here is, if there was a big banner at the top of this slide, I think we would call it cautionary tales or things to be looking out from the front end, right? And I think the idea that I want to convey the most on this slide is that, at least in my experience, the team that you work with is more than willing to make whatever accommodations you think fit your community and your community's process and the dynamic of your community. But it is extremely, extremely important to just make sure that you're thinking about them now ahead of time and then communicate them, right? And so I'll give a couple examples here just to sort of let you know a little bit more about what I mean. One of the common things and really easy things to be thinking about now is this idea of honoring and compensating community specialists. And Lydia sort of touched on this a couple slides ago. And one way of thinking about this compensation is, of course, if somebody's going to be part of the professional team, who gets paid to, write content or review content or whatever, presuming that your community has the resources to do that, that's fine. Of course, not all communities have the resources for that, but that's not all we mean when we talk about compensation, right? In many Native communities, as you all know, it is very important to follow community protocols around asking people for oral histories or to share songs and stories or knowledge or skills that they might have to lend to the process. And Split Rock and design firms like theirs are completely willing to help provide tobacco as gifts, to provide blankets as gifts, whatever the protocol your community is to make it appropriate to do that. But you have to let us know ahead of time so that we can build that into our budget and build it into our planning process so that we're not blindsided by it, right? Another good one to think about this is dealing with language and translation. I mean, as many of you know are intimately familiar with, unfortunately, Indigenous languages have been under pretty incredible assault through the process of assimilation. And many of them, there's communities where there's really robust, rebuilding and language revitalization programs, but only a handful of speakers, right? And one of the things we also know is that because of the long legacies of non-Native anthropologists working in Native communities, there's often disagreement within the speaker communities over dialects, orthographies, spellings, all of that sort of thing. And in one case, a project that I worked on with Split Rock, there was so much, there's, you know, ongoing debate within the community about the different orthographies for the languages that needed to be used in this exhibit, to the extent that we had to design all of the graphic panels, or at least a substantial number of the graphic panels, to have entire sections that could be removed and replaced if down the road the community decided to you know, change the official spelling or the official translation for certain words, right? And we were happy to do it. The point was just we needed to know that ahead of time, because you know, there's cost implications for that. There's time implications for that, because it, you know, it takes more money to be able to design a changeable graphic than it does one that you print one time at the beginning and move on. So I think Lydia also had a language story she wanted to share too, so I'll let her do that.
I have another story, actually. In terms of the honoring and compensating community specialists portion, I made it clear in the RFP that it was written that the contractor, the design development firm, came with a Native consultant, so that they were there to help facilitate any possible miscommunications or, you know, any further discussions about process and protocol. So that was important. And in the beginning, it didn't really seem as though it was incredibly needed, because, you know, Split Rock did a really great job in coming in and explaining the process. And, you know, a little bit down the line, it turned out, you know, that we were able to call on our consultant, and, you know, he was there for, you know, every meeting. But, you know, it's a long process. And, you know, I thought that it was important that the design firm came with a Native consultant. And that's definitely, you know, something that you could add if you feel, you know, that you also need, you know, that support as well. But yeah, a lot of changes, a lot of changes in the process. So just let alone the graphic, we had an orthography change in the middle. I would almost say, I think we had, you know, items printed already, right, Colin?
Yeah, that'll happen sometimes.
There were big items that were printed that needed to be redone, and, you know, still some of that process, and you know, it's new, you know, especially if you have a new group of people that are coming through on a regular basis and need to understand, you know, what happened in the past and coming forward. I think it's really important for that communication to happen, and, you know, that the record keeping is there so that people understand this is where we're at in this part of the project. If some people want to come and just be a part of this and learn, whereas others, you know, need to come and actually contribute. And sometimes that could be, in Indian country, that can be a challenge as well.
Yeah, and there was a decision early on that was, we're going to include as much language as possible, be it you know, be it audio or be it written. And because there was no, I think, reliable orthography that we could look at, a lot of that fell on the community. And I mean, it really did take a heck of a lot of work for like a separate group from who was reviewing it. There was a separate group that had to then, instead of do whatever they had planned for that day, was, hey, here's 20 graphic panels that all need to be translated. Oh yeah, and then we're going to need it, you know, by next week. And I think if you have an understanding of how much of that, you know, what those resources are, where you're going to gather that information, you know that ahead of time, then maybe it'll help you. I think it'll help with planning down the road. You know, I think we at the time hadn't really considered how much time all of that was going to take, and I think it made it a little more stressful than it neaded to be, you know, in hindsight. But again, I mean, that's why we're here today, is because that's what we learned from the project. And yes, having our advisor with us, our consultant, he mentioned some of the things that Eric had mentioned, and I think he was there to help us really get off on the right foot And then as Lydia was, I think, gently alluding to, he became a critical go-between between our teams, very, I guess, maybe the middle of the process. And he was very helpful in that instance. And, we had a slight hiccup, but we were all able to get past that.
And, I want to take we have a question here from Helen who says that it seems like the exhibit should have a panel on orthography because that could be interesting and educational. And actually, you're absolutely right, Helen. One of the things that we did in the project I was talking about was there at the very beginning, there was a panel that basically said in so many words, we know that you might not agree with these spellings and translations and stuff. This is an ongoing process. And they actually used it not only to educate people in the community about the choices that had been made, but to encourage them to engage with the staff if they had, alternative ideas or spellings or sources that they could share. And so that framing piece was a way of engaging the audience. And then the changeable graphics in the exhibit was where they could eventually change it once that part was done, right? So there are ways to be thinking and to continue the mission of your interpretive center or cultural center, which is to engage the community in talking about these issues in really interesting ways. A couple other things that here we wanted to touch on. When you go through an exhibit process, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, not only is, there are an enormous amount of details about the planning for what goes in the exhibit, but somebody has to create all of those things, right? From, replicas of artifacts or, early stone or bone tools or pottery or regalia or whatever it might be, all the way up to, photography and even painting murals, right? And there are a million good reasons that both make sense and I think we all agree with as a philosophy of practice for why, if you're getting money from your tribal government or from a federal grant or from a donor or wherever, that your community might want to funnel that money to community members who are professionals to do the work, right? Completely support that idea. Just make sure that you communicate it again at the very beginning so that we can plan for it. I had a really challenging experience once on an exhibit of having all of the photos and everything selected, and we actually got them approved from the steering committee. And so in a contractual sense, it was like, these are good to go, let's print these. And then the community came back and said, every single photo that's not a historic picture, every new landscape shot, every the aerial view of the construction process for the Interpretive Center, everything had to be taken by a tribal member. And again, completely agree with that as a philosophy, but it meant we had to go back and retroactively hire someone to take all those photos, which was just an enormous challenge and one we could have, headed off from the beginning. And just another, quick point for this fourth bullet here. Everybody knows that, life happens, right? People retire, new people come on board, people have stuff going on in their personal lives, whatever. You can't control who all is going to be on the staff and who all is going to be on the steering committee the whole time overall. But it is important to do the best that you can to maintain some sort of cohesion, because the people 3 years ago who were in that room having the tough conversations about what happened to the people and what happened to the language and how this museum or exhibit or cultural center should tell these stories should be the same people who were there at the end to approve it, because you might end up in the situation where the people who are approving it are going, why'd we do it this way in the first place? And without somebody there to be able to say, well, we talked about it and here's what we decided because of this reason and that reason, you can end up in a really awkward spot of having the development team try to explain to people what that process looked like after the fact. And it's just really sort of a test of the trust, and it's can be challenging and lead to some problems because it leads to changes that happen at the very last minute.
Yeah, and on that note, I came across that as, they had already started design meetings in regards to the construction of the building, where I came on board and I said we need to make sure we're taking attendance. There's sign-in sheets. There's a record of who was at the meeting and who left the meeting and who wasn't there a part of making that decision. That was important. That was important for us too. So, having somebody there from a project management standpoint on the tribe's behalf is important as well, because the design development people will have those notes too, but to us, I felt like sometimes it wasn't, as strict on our behalf, so that we know, X person left at 11, and that's why they weren't here for the end of the meeting when the group decided on this. So that was important too.
Lydia, did you want to speak to the, low on time here, but did you want to speak to the artifact photo research loans and permissions process?
Yeah. See, like I've said, every tribe is unique, and some groups are coming with a collection and some aren't. And fortunately for the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux Dakota people, they had a collection. They hadn't had a collections manager or policies or guidelines that that overseen and managed the collection. So that came on as I came on board, and being that there needed to be an inventory, photographs. It had been in a restricted area that was not really open to. It was open to the members, but not really, something that was something incredibly um, consistent anyway. So, we knew that we had some internal tribal resources with our own collection, but knowing that there were going to be some gaps that we needed to accomplish. And obviously our first choice was going to be the Smithsonian. But I think, because of the nature of the community being as private as it is, we needed to go out and do our own outreach to the local county historical societies and our state historical society, which at the time we weren't allowed because there was a moratorium from the state. So that left it kind of left just a sort of, more of a challenge. But I mean, it's clearly obvious, that there are more items out there. It's just, it's almost, sometimes it feels like that's almost a full-time job, just doing the object research alone. But I knew that, a great source was going to be going to NMAI. One of the big things was reiterating to the Business Council on how important it was to have a delegation go and visit the Smithsonian to see the Cultural Resources Department. And not a lot of tribes have that, the funding to do something like that. It is an enormous feat. We did have, and that's that bottom slide there. Colin picked out the one slide with all the NMAI staffers, but I'm gonna get over that, Colin. We had close to 6 of us that went to Suitland. We were there for about 2 days. It's a very emotional trip, for a lot of people that aren't, involved so much with the industry. I had, on the other side, have been on the receiving end of trips such as this, and and it was the first time that the Mdewakanton Dakota had been there in an official capacity. So we had, a lot of positive feedback from the members. One of them had said that it had changed her life going, and they were just a very, very welcoming group of people. And it's a lot of work, especially for just 2 days, but we were able to get the council to decide that was important. And just even beforehand, knowing through conversations with the Conservation and Registration Department on how expensive it was going to be, and knowing beforehand, how much money that you would need to have, even if you didn't go. And it's important that you do go. And we went with the delegation and our cultural resources director, but it could be a winding road working through the mechanics of all the regulations with the Smithsonian. There are a variety of protocols, procedures that your facility and your space need to have met. Not so much particularly as far as staff, I kind of was a little surprised on that. I think I'm running into that a little bit on the state side. We are looking at possibly becoming a repository for the state. We fit, the guidelines, so that's kind of a good thing for us because we would be the only one in the region that would have the capacity to do that. But by getting our general facilities report completed, working with everyone in our gaming side, the casino, surveillance, marketing, our security people, having them all on board with getting this facility report completed, submitting that with our collections plan is very critical. They don't really require a collections plan, but it looks better in curatorial review, knowing that we went through the hurdles of funding for the conservation work that needed to be done, which is one of the very biggest reasons why it's so critical to be on site at the CRC, the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland, because some of the objects that I had seen on paper, which looked really great, were needed a lot of work in order to travel and to be on display. So that costed more money in terms of conservation work and what type of mount was going to be on that object. Having the money for the insurance, having the money for the courier, that wasn't all determined until we knew what objects were going to be coming here. So yes, and that's just one facility. So if you're looking at anything state or historical or private, the Smithsonian does have guidelines on sharing objects in a case, which are a little, I was surprised about because, they don't prefer to share. And, the cases are not cheap. So that's something to consider as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so thinking about that stuff earlier on, do I want an object-heavy exhibit? What are the resources for those objects? And if you can start doing some with local historical societies, the Smithsonian, maybe the state historical.
And your tribal members.
Yeah.
Yeah,
indeed.
It's really important, especially for groups that are coming on board that don't house a collection, and understanding what we do as an industry. We're still one first year, and some of the members are still okay, is it okay for me to give up that baseball uniform that my great grandpa wore, when we're talking about the sports section in the native, the logos, and because we had a section in that in our exhibit. And it's gaining that trust to say, okay, I'm going to let you have this, where we as Indian people all know what happens in museums and what is historically how we perceive museums. So that's really important too, is making sure that you've also touched base locally if that's the case. And like Colin said, if you want it to be something that's object heavy as well.
Yeah, and then your exhibit designer is going to work with you too to provide what's needed for Smithsonian. We had to, once the objects are determined, also it's nice to have a big list to choose from, right? And to be able to craft your story, the artifacts. And so we would prepare like a mock-up, like you're seeing in the top right photo, that has all of the objects laid out, and their approximate sizes in there, how they're going to be mounted, all that stuff, at least on the SMSC project, had to go through Smithsonian. So you do have a partner in that. But even before you engage with that partner, if you have an idea of where you're going to be looking or even what's out there, then you'll be better off for it.
Yeah.
And I know like we've kind of, the process, I hope that we didn't speak too much in, generalities, and feel free to ask us any questions. We'll zip this one right up. But I think Lydia spoke about getting your budget under control and planning for unplanned costs, I guess. She mentioned that when they thought that they were going to get the Smithsonian artifacts, yay, they're going to loan them to us. Hey, by the way, you're going to have to pay for conservation.
Yep.
Ching. We're going to have to ship them, which I know that somebody added to that in the chat there.
Mhm.
And everything's got to be insured. And
And you have to comply with a Smithsonian, a federally approved mount maker, and you have to bring him here. And sometimes the cases don't come on time. And sometimes we're waiting for glass at the very last minute, and
yeah,
you know, the mounts have to wait. So we
Mhm.
were able to, in retrospect, you know, we were able to feel fortunate to have our mount maker on site so he can help us with other various areas that we needed mounts for, because
yeah,
fortunately for us, we not only had an exhibit, but we had a building to open and
Mhm.
staff and grand opening, and yeah, so that's
Yeah.
part of it too.
It was great. I mean, yes, it was a stressful process at the end, but I mean, everybody really pulled together as a team. Other external budgetary things to consider. If there's one thing that I can get you to think about, or that we can get you to think about, because I know how stressful it was for Lydia and for me. The top right just shows us putting a mural up. So I just want to draw your attention to the fact that in the in the photo you have some, you know, kind of like some wires coming from the ceiling. Notice the wall is painted, the carpet. All those things typically would go into a general contractor's budget. Doesn't necessarily have to, but think about that ahead of time so you can say to the exhibit designer, listen, any changes you make to this room, that's on you. You're going to have to find somewhere to pay for it. Okay, well, just understand it's going to come out of the exhibit budget. That's fine. But either way, you want to make sure there's not a scope gap for your exhibit space and the needs of it. The easiest way to accomplish that is to have, you know, ideally your architect and your exhibit designer, you know, frankly, your landscape designer, that all those teams are kind of somewhat aligned in their processes. So, you know, maybe if the architect goes first, that's fine, but then that information gets down to the designer. So everybody has a chance to collaborate. And so earlier on, we can say, hey, this wall needs to be a level 5 finish because we have a mural going on it. And these walls need to be painted green, and I need this outlet there. So just make sure you know that the money for the space has to come from somewhere. And yeah, that's it. Lydia, did you want to add to the understanding budget costs and planning? I'm really speaking in the generalization. I can.
Yeah, I think that, you know, kind of coming into this project and hoping that, you know, there was a carefully laid plan out. You know, sometimes there isn't, and you know, pick up the pieces that you do have, you work through some of that. You know, I look at it from a different perspective when, you know, I work for other tribes that didn't have the financial resources that the SMSC does have, and knowing, you know, that a lot of times without having a collection space, a secured environmental controlled area, that a lot of that object research would have to come out of state. I do know that there are, you know, collections internationally that house some items that, you know, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of funding to have them return home. And that can, you know, cost a lot of money if the tribe doesn't, you know, have some of the basic transportation resources locally. So I think, you know, when I was thinking about putting this budget together and understanding that, you know, that the council was supportive of this, made me, you know, remember when I'd worked for other tribes that, you know, needed, you know, some of these resources and didn't necessarily have them, but yet it was something that was always part of their economic development or their tourism plan. Having the grant money to go forward, you know, a lot of times if you're applying to IMLS funding and, you know, all the planning that you have to do ahead of time, you know, sometimes that could take some time. You know, at the time, I remember I was in a bit of competition with the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and the Minnesota History Center, because they were both putting together exhibits and looking at the Smithsonian at the same time. So, you know, you know, we talk about this lead time that needs to happen with the design alone, but, you know, understanding what those objects are and balancing that time with your budget is so critical, because, you know, I was fortunate not to have to seek grant funding for this project.
Yeah. Okay. Eric, I know we haven't heard from you in a second.
No, you guys are doing a great job. The only thing that I would mention that we had talked about when we rehearsed this was for everybody to keep in mind staff capacity, right? Oftentimes new exhibits, you're building both a building, which is new construction, and an exhibit inside of it. And those are different undertakings, right? And a number of different times in my relatively short career, I've encountered people in both, you know, native and non-native projects where they have one person whose job is to oversee all of that at once. And if you have the resources or can find the resources for additional staff, you should think about it, because it's just too much for one person to try to, you know, be in 10 meetings with the general contractor and then in a meeting about, you know, the exhibits. And then oftentimes there's other, you know, collections and programming related discussions going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for all those players or committees or however you organize it to be talking to one another so it's coherent, you know. In Colin's example here, to make sure the wall's in the right spot for where the lights are going to be and outlets are and stuff. But to have one person or even one or two people be in charge of all of that at once can easily overwhelm and in some cases, you know, even be detrimental to the process, because people just need more time than they have in a day. So
yeah. When I came on board on this project, there had been a tribal planner that had been a part of it initially, and that person had no museum experience or had built a museum before, so that came with its challenges as well. But, you know, bringing other staff on board to realize, you know, first off, you know, we need to have somebody managing our collection. We need to have somebody helping to manage the meetings, because I'm attending meetings and things are going on. I can't be sitting there taking the notes on what's all recording, what's all happening. So that was important too. I see there's a question here about the interactive and historic recordings in any of the exhibits. Yes, we do have some. And what made it really unique is that we were able to use some of the community members who were direct descendants of the individuals that are being quoted in the exhibit. And we're also able to use our casino for these audio recordings. So that made that very unique. And I think Colin at the time was like, this is the first time I've ever been able to be somewhere where you guys you could just go down the road and have that done. So that was really nice. But yeah, our loans are long-term, so we're hoping they'll be permanent.
And Stormy asked if we've done rotating exhibits. Split Rock Studios in particular does not typically create, I mean, that would be like a temporary exhibit. So not typically. That's something that we do. In the instance that you were to get a rotating exhibit, there's a lot of resources for those. And I do believe that they ship those out to you, you know, with instructions on how to set them up. But I mean, the firms that create those typically are specialized in, you know, creating things that can easily go up and easily go down. Stormy, were you asking if anybody like would create a rotating exhibit that is that's custom, you know, maybe to your community?
Can I, while Stormy's either typing her response or logging in, just answer this way to tie those two ideas together, both Susan and Stormy's questions?
Yeah.
So a lot of the exhibits that Split Rock does, you know, have all kinds of different interactives. I mean, touch screens, you know, apps that complement stuff, audio immersive experiences. There's another question here, I think, about audio sources. You know, we have had people go, you know, record current living community members tell stories or share oral histories and experiences. We've had it where people can go give oral histories and have them recorded on site to help create that for the archives part of the cultural center. We've also had places where, you walk into a spot and 100-year-old gardening song plays around you as you do interactives that deal with, agricultural history and gardening history within a community, all of that kind of stuff. And also when it comes to rotating exhibits, although what Colin just said is true, that those are often sort of prefabricated by another entity, your exhibit team will sometimes help you plan and draw out a rotating exhibit space on the exhibit floor, right? So while they'll be helping develop the permanent exhibits that'll be there long term, they'll often draw out a spot on the floor plan where this is going to be where your rotating exhibits come in. And sometimes there's infrastructure things that need to be there and security things that need to be there. But the reason I mention it is in part because, back to the point I made a few minutes ago, I have had the experience before of having a building being built, a permanent exhibit being built, and a space for a rotating exhibit. And as the grand opening day came up, people realized we don't have a rotating exhibit for our grand opening, right? Because we were so focused on the permanent exhibit that we never built a rotating exhibit to be done at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you just have to be thinking ahead about how to coordinate those things and make sure you have enough staff to do it so they're not, so you're not just scrambling at the last minute to try to get that stuff together before the ribbon gets cut.
They'll always be scrambling.
Yeah, minimize the scrambling, I guess.
Yeah. It's Indian country. There'll be a little bit of scramble in there, but we kind of had that same experience too. And, the architects had built casework on the bottom level, and, it had cases that weren't, museum quality. So, that's why I said it was great to have our mount maker here on site. And I think that, his experience being here with us kind of brought it to a whole nother level, because, he got to understand, the true story as to why, we went with this particular approach towards this project, and, why we were where we were at with it. So it was great to have him there. But yeah, that's really important. I know, as we're sort of getting more acclimated to our space, I've thought about the same thing about doing a rotating exhibit, because especially now, I would have never foreseen that we were going to be opening our first year in the middle of a pandemic. I had assumptions on how this, how people would view the facility, and to know that interactives aren't going to be as looked upon as great as they were when we developed them a year ago. It's striking to be able to see people being comfortable coming into our space. Our building is only open to the public 1/3 of the space. So we're at 88,000 square feet, and a lot of people didn't understand, is it even open to the public, or if it is, why is it such a small area? So they had discussed on expanding the exhibit when we first came in, and now we're to a point where it's kind of like, we're glad that the space is big, but limiting how many people we have in our exhibit, and how we're understanding how these interactives can still be incorporated maybe in a different form. I don't know. I looked a little bit at, what was that? There's like an eyesight trigger now. I don't know, Colin, if you were familiar with it a little bit, but.
Eyesight trigger? Yeah,
where either like kind of reading your eye, and that you could sort of motion with your hand so that it'll turn something on instead of having to actually touch it.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's like a 3D camera. Those have become a bit more, ubiquitous, common.
Yeah, but I mean, it's something to consider.
Yeah, and National Park Service, if anybody needs them, has guidelines for cleaning exhibitry too. So if you were looking for, I know they released those fairly recently. But yeah, like Lydia mentioned, we wanted to include a number of tactile experiences, a lot of hands-on. And now there's a pandemic. And But I also think that I really hope that the country can get this thing under control at a certain point. So I don't think we have to throw all old exhibit approaches out the window, but yes, there's got to be some adapting. And the thing with technology to consider, not that I'm against it, you want to have a balance. You know, at SMSC, we had a number of touch screens and we had a big movie. We knew how much budget we wanted to allocate to that and which experiences might work best as a touchscreen. And that's where we decided to have those done. But with technology, you have to have in-house personnel that's going to look after that technology too. You know, if it's going to be somewhat complicated and it's going to have a rack room and all of that, then just just make sure you have staff you have IT staff would be good. Or another way to do that is your integrator, so the person who like installs the equipment, if they're local, that can be an advantage because then you can just call them, they can drive right over to your spot, depending on your location. For every, that's not necessarily something that you're going to have depending on where you're at. But there's different ways of going about it. So again, just something to think about.
It looks like Stormy joined us and has been patiently waiting to ask her question about rotating exhibits.
That's okay. You guys definitely answered my questions. Yeah, I was just thinking something, I think kind of one of our visions was like a rotating exhibit, like a seasonal thing or an educational kind of thing. We do a lot of work with the local schools. And so if they ever get to come visit us, that would be something that we hope for. But to have that, where we can change it out and incorporate our language, maybe we have like a certain word of the month or something and stuff like that. So.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Stormy, you raised a really good point, and it was not how I had first interpreted rotating. There is what you're talking about, which is, developing parts of the permanent exhibit that can be changed or adapted seasonally. Because, as everybody watching probably knows, a lot of Native communities have stories that can only be told certain times of year. The story about the activities communities would have undertaken years ago changed year to year. And if that's important to you and important to your tribe and the story you want to tell, talk to your exhibit development team during the design process so that they can build in elements that you can highlight at different times of year, which, is part of the permanent exhibit, but it creates a new experience at different moments. So people keep coming back and school groups keep coming back and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely a good, that way, things change. I know I can go to the same museum and look at the same things, a few times, but some people probably get bored with that, so.
Well, and the other thing is to consider, I had this discussion earlier with our staff is, we have a hands-on collection and, that's changing incredibly. What are hands-on collections doing now in light of all of this COVID? I know people are kind of looking at what does that material look like? And, that's another thing to think about. We're looking at, lesser numbers of tours coming through. We haven't had any requests from school groups coming in. Things in our industry are drastically changing. So, if that is something that, I would love to be able to discuss. I think that right now that the council that, we had, invested in this much in the people and having these gathering spaces, we are a portion of us are a museum. We are a cultural center. We, place-based art making spaces, there's language learning. There's, an area for the council to meet and have the space that they have now. Whereas, in the past, they've had to, have some of their larger functions in the casino convention because they just didn't have that, for the community, for community gatherings. That's what's also important about what we do too. But, we'll be finding out once school starts, what kind of school groups are going to be coming through.
Then it's up to, so Susan asked if there's any workbooks or forms a planning timeline. I got a general schedule I could create. In terms of workbooks or forms, you know, it might be something that we could meet with. I could meet with Eric and Lydia and talk about, you know, what kind of documents would I, you know, if I would have had up front, or Lydia could say, like, if I would have had up front, we could maybe pull those together and share them with everybody. I think that would be neat. Maybe if we can give them some examples of designs, depending on that permission. Has anybody here, have a lot of people on the phone or on the Zoom developed an exhibit before? I think that's one thing that I just totally take for granted because I've been doing it. You know, go in there, I'm like, yeah, here's the process, and we're going to build it, then we're going to install, it's going to be great. You know, they're like, whoa, what are you talking about? You know, has anybody had that experience before? Yeah, and it's again, I take it for granted, and it's something that I had to learn to slow down on, and we have to, as the, you know, on the vendor side, have to remember that oftentimes this is the first time and maybe the only time. And so, you know, making sure that we're communicating the steps properly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, you know, I think that, you know, what I appreciated about Split Rock is, you know, they were able to modify, you know, based on, you know, the various processes and the various unprocesses that the community had, because a lot of it was, you know, our members who needed to understand, you know, what does a museum do? What does an exhibit do? You know, like I probably mentioned, you know, there's only portions of the building that's even open to the public, and making sure that, you know, people can come in, the children can come in and we could take, because, you know, it's a general thought that the exhibit space is not big enough. You know, when we have we have a huge 88,000 square foot facility and only a small portion of it is dedicated to the public and the exhibit. It seemed as though, you know, we could go further and further into all those areas, and just kind of, you know, we were just kind of brushing the surface on it, that we could kind of take it to another level, and you know, bring it into other areas in the building that were only limited to just the tribal members.
I have tons of stories.
I was gonna suggest, Colin. I mean, of course, as everybody sees here, we have our emails up, and if anybody has individual questions, please feel free to reach out. But if anybody wanted to either, you know, join and ask us a question verbally or type in a question, we have a couple more minutes, and until Melissa pulls the plug, we're happy to answer them.
Yeah, I think someone had asked. I think that's like a budget question. Lydia, it's up to you if you. I don't know if you have permission to release that information or not.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, the final cost of the exhibit, you know, we were looking at about 3,800 square feet. The total cost of the exhibit. So this was to design the exhibits, to build them, and to install them. And it included all the audio visual hardware and software. Was about 2.5 million. So that was a healthy budget for that size space. It allowed us to do some pretty neat things, especially with the theater, which was shaped like a teepee, in that it was like concave, and just know that it was a bear to project on that, but it was very worthwhile, and it's a unique experience for people when they come there.
Yeah, and that price did not include the actual the courier, the conservation work, and
right.
the mount maker.
The mount maker, right. I mean, so those are the things you want to make sure that and you could, it's not to say that those things can't be in your vendor's budget. They can be. But if they don't see that in that RFP, when they see the budget, then they're probably going to say in their quote that this only includes the exhibits, and it's not going to include like general contracting work, or artifact mounting. I think Lydia and I, when we were working with the budget, it became clear that it might be easier to shift that responsibility of the artifact mounter to SMSC as a way of, I guess, tackling a budget issue that we were running into. But you know, I just want, typically those general contracting, finishing that room, putting down carpet, painting the walls, like that stuff is not going to be in an exhibit contractor's budget. And if you know up front, then you don't get that scope gap. And you'll hear that word a lot if you're developing a new building, scope gap. Let it happen.
This is a little detailed and in the weeds, but that point that you made earlier about the square footage when you were talking about the budget is an important one for everybody to keep in mind, because, you know, when the relationship of your dollars to the size of your place matters a lot, right? I mean, you might, in a perfect world, let's just all dream, right? And say your council or whoever it is comes along and says, here's $2.5 million to go build an exhibit. If it's a relatively small building, you could be doing really earth-shattering stuff, right? But if it's a giant cavernous building, $2.5 million might not be enough to, you know, go that far, right? I mean, there's sort of a relationship between space and money, and to think about it in terms of how much does our budget fit per square foot in this facility is a really good one if you can have those in your sort of planning and budgeting discussions at the very front end.
Yep.
Late sometimes.
Any other questions hanging out there?
Much was the budget for the couriering, etc. Just like, so Lydia, when you had that agreement with Smithsonian, right? You know, what were the different, almost like line items that were in that bill? You know, it was like acquiring or the actual loan of getting the objects. Then there was the delivery of the objects. I don't know if you want to put mount making in there, because that number can fluctuate depending on obviously the number of objects. So that may, you know, that's going to be different in the complexity of the mount. But Lydia, you know, how much did you end up paying Smithsonian to borrow? If you're comfortable talking about it, how many objects did we end up getting? The 30?
We got, it was an interesting number because it ended up to be 38. So, yeah. And like I said, it's, you know, it's a careful balance between, you know, what you actually decide upon. You know, I was insistent that we needed to have a shirt, and the shirt had a lot of restorative work that needed to happen. There was a quilled bag that was, you know, one of the oldest items that I'd chosen. And, you know, for a minute there, it almost didn't come with us. But that turned out to be a lot of work to get restorative work done. And yeah, I really can't give you a number off the top of my head. All I know is what, you know, I was just sort of planning to put in my budget through a discussion that I had with the conservation department, and it ended up to be over that amount. So I said, okay, I'm putting my budget in, and I know that this is supposed to happen in a year and a half from now, but at least I need to know now how much it's going to cost. So it was, you know, there was definitely a need for contingency funds. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to have a planning budget to be able to use for that. So, I mean, all in all, it came within our budget. So it wasn't that, you know, and the building came within budget as well too. You know, there were items that the community had initially wanted, you know, a green roof, and I think there was a couple other big elements that we stripped to make, you know, the budget work. But, you know, ultimately I just overestimated the amount that, you know, NMAI had stated that we needed. But in the end, because it came out of my general operating budget, it didn't come out of the capital campaign that we had for the facility. But I mean, in the end, when, you know, we needed, you know, our mount maker to be here on site, that, you know, that was important. But I think one of the stipulations that I didn't expect right away coming into this was that the Smithsonian had that stipulation, you know, we don't really care to share cases with other with other objects. So say for instance, if, you know, because we had gone to the Field Museum, if we had borrowed items from the Field Museum, how those were going to, you know, be on display and sharing a case with NMAI objects. They didn't really prefer, oh, if you're going to the field, you know, we need to make sure that the loan periods were consistent. So if there was anybody coming in, and we're also very fortunate that our NMAI proxy, our conservator had some time and has family in Minnesota. So she comes on a regular basis, and she'll, you know, come and look. Whereas we'll have to pay for that in the long run, is having somebody come and, you know, oversee. We do have another another presentation all about the loan. So maybe you guys will be on that call too.
Yeah. When you were initiating that conversation with Smithsonian, Lydia, like how does that start? Did you contacted them and said, I'm looking for...
It was difficult. It was difficult, and I'll be straight up with that. You know, the Smithsonian is a large federal institution, and sometimes people don't call you back. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to know some people, specifically in the conservation department, that I knew because I'd spent some time there earlier on after I graduated from college. So I was able to cut through some of that red tape. But, you know, I went through the regular procedure with trying to, you know, go through getting a loan, and it actually took, you know, other ways to get people to, you know, answer phone calls. And, you know, that was and once that came about, it was a whole year before, you know, we actually made our site visit. So the Smithsonian, they kind of take a little bit, you know, they've got a lot of regulations that they have to follow. So you have to remember that as well too. So the better you can get locally, it would be nice.
Okay.
All right. Well, do we have any more questions before we wrap up for the day? This has been a great presentation, very informative. I really appreciate you being here today, Colin and Eric and Lydia. And I will make sure that a copy of this recording is on our webpage, and then Colin, if you'll send me a copy of the PowerPoint, we'll also upload that and any other supporting documents. I know everyone would appreciate that.
Yeah, certainly. It might take me a while to pull that stuff together, but you know, I think we can think of some nice stuff that would really help people on that front end. Yep. So thank you for having us.
Oh, no, thank you. We really appreciate it. All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful day, and I will see you all next Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.